O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not listen? How long will violence be all around us? How long will human beings keep devising new and more efficient ways to take the lives of others? How long will weapons consume national budgets and make their ways into the hands of people who would do harm? How long will children fear going to school or women fear walking in the city at night? How long? How long will we have to look at wrongdoing and trouble? How long will people pay no heed to the effects of their actions on this fragile planet and its inhabitants of all kinds? How long will natural disasters batter the most vulnerable? How long will treatable illnesses claim lives? How long? How long will strife and contention arise? How long will people treat those who disagree with them as less than human? How long will people shout instead of listen? How long will people harden into their camps so completely that we lose all notion of the common good? How long? How long will the law become slack and justice be trampled upon? How long will the powerful get away with deception, with theft, with murder? How long will human beings persist in discriminating against those with different skin color or religion or sexual orientation? How long will the table be open only to those who are privileged and deemed worthy? How long are you going to let all of this go on, God? It is a mess down here, so come on, answer. How long? I think people sometimes have the idea that it's only in recent years that we have noticed there might be some tension between the idea of a good God and the messy world that we live in, like that's all a uniquely modern or postmodern problem. But the truth is, people have been noticing that tension and leaning all the way into it for a very long time. Just ask Habakkuk. And just to get this out of the way right now, no, I'm not absolutely sure that's how you say his name, but I don't think anybody is. Habakkuk asked his questions of God 2,600 years ago. He looked at the world around him and at his idea of who God was, and something did not seem right. We don't know very much about this prophet. You may not have heard much about him yourself. The short book that bears his name comes without a date or any words about who happened to be king at the time. And while most prophets spend their time lifting up their voices in front of rulers and their fellow citizens, Habakkuk seems to have spent his time praying. This book has no public addresses at all. Instead, it is all a conversation between the prophet and God. And as we already heard this morning in our reading, it starts off with a bang. Habakkuk skips the pleasantries and gets right to what he really wants to say. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not listen? Based on language and content, scholars think this book was written around the year 600 BCE, when the Babylonian army had already occupied the kingdom of Judah. They hadn't destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple just yet, but the writing was there on the wall. Violence and injustice and wrongdoing and strife were all around, and more seemed to be coming. So this was not an easy time to be a prophet, to be somebody who glimpsed the goodness and faithfulness and righteousness of God in all of this. But Habakkuk does what he knows to do. He pays attention to the world around him, and he cries out to God with the words that come to him. O Lord, how long? He cries out, and you heard that he also does one more remarkable thing. He waits for an answer. After enumerating his grievances to God, after demanding that God account for what's happening around him, he settles in to wait. I will stand at my watchpost, he says, and station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch to see what he will say to me and what he will answer concerning my complaint. I do want to pause there to notice just what a remarkably bold thing to do that is. In the middle of a time when visions of God's goodness were hard to find, when it was profoundly unclear what God was up to, This prophet is convinced that God is still going to show up, that God is still going to respond. I will keep watch and see what God will say to me, Habakkuk declares. Under those circumstances, you can imagine many coming to the conclusion that God had sort of run out of things to say, that God had taken a vacation or simply left the world to its own corrupt devices. You can understand how some in our own times come to those sorts of conclusions too. In the middle of all the bad news, all the cries of how long rising up from so many places, it's not always easy to keep listening for a divine reply. But Habakkuk clings to a belief that God will respond, that God will not go silent forever. Maybe that is part of what makes him a prophet. I will keep watch, he says. He expects an answer from God, and one does finally come. And what is it? Wait. There is still a vision for the appointed time, God says. If it seems to tarry, wait for it. I don't know if that's exactly the answer Habakkuk was hoping for. Wait is almost never the answer any of us are ever hoping for. Whether the question is about the job we've applied for, or the results of the doctor's tests, or whether we'll get into the school that we want to go to, or what God is up to in the middle of a chaotic world, wait is never what we want to hear. But it is an answer. It is a word from God here, a response to the prophet's prayer, an assurance that God is not finished, that God has not gone silent. Wait means the story is still in progress, and there's more left to be written. Wait means that God is still up to something. And along with saying wait, God also says something important about what waiting in the presence of God looks like. The righteous live by their faith. That's the sort of biblical language I'm afraid we often just zip right over because it sounds so familiar and so thoroughly religious. Right, the righteous live by their faith. Got it? But what does that familiar religious language actually mean here? We often talk about the Christian faith, by which we usually mean a set of beliefs and practices. Beliefs about who God is and what life is about, the sorts of things that we'll say together in the Apostles' Creed in a little bit, and practices that help us live out those beliefs, things like prayer and hospitality and giving generously. That's certainly one way to talk about faith, but it doesn't really seem like that's what's being talked about here. There's no mention at all of a set of formal beliefs or practices. Another way we might hear that word faith is to imagine a particular religious capacity or skill, something we could be better or worse at, right? We may not usually think of it this way, but I think it's probably there as an idea in our minds still. In today's gospel reading, the disciples clearly have this idea. They think that what they need is sort of bigger faith muscles. Increase our faith, they say to Jesus. They seem to think it's something that they can just have more of, like their tanks are just low and they need to go to the filling station. But Jesus is pretty clear that this is not how faith works. It's not something you measure by quantity at all, since even the tiniest little bit can make a world of difference. None of these ideas seem to be what God is pointing to with that language of living by faith. There's no talk of a particular set of religious beliefs or practices, no indication of a heroic amount of some magic ingredient called faith that's called for. In fact, it seems that God is pointing to something much simpler here. Faith really amounts to being in a living relationship with the God who is faithful. It means keeping the conversation open, even when the outcome isn't clear. It means being honest enough to bring God not just some pious words you think you're supposed to say, but your real joys, your real worries, your real concerns, even complaints. It means arguing with God when you need to. And it means expecting God to respond, expecting that the story isn't over, that God still has more to do. Don't miss that last one, because maybe it all comes down to that expectation that God is not finished. When the Bible talks about faith, you can often substitute the word trust there. That's the profound invitation here to the prophet and to everybody else living through uncertain times. Live by faith. Live trusting God to keep acting, to keep healing, to keep bringing new life. Faith understood that way, as living in a deep and trusting relationship with God, will not fix everything around you. It won't provide quick answers. It won't end the waiting. But it might make the journey possible. Pope Francis says this beautifully. Faith is not a light that scatters all the darkness, he said, but a lamp that guides our steps in the night and suffices for the journey. That's finally what we need in uncertain times, isn't it? Just enough light to keep us going. Enough light to see where to put your feet tomorrow. Enough light to see what simple, concrete actions you can take toward the world that God envisions. Enough light to see how you can take another step toward justice and joy. Habakkuk himself is actually a profound example of all of this. In his trusting relationship with God, marked by honesty and arguing and waiting, this prophet is a wonderful example of what living by faith actually looks like. And I have to share the very ending of the book with you. There's no real spoiler here. Just more conversation between the prophet and God. God never does swoop out of the sky and do away with the Babylonians who've brought such destruction on the people. Nothing changes in that sense, but something does seem to change inside the prophet. Because this is how the book ends. These are the last words. Though the fig tree does not bloom, and no fruit is on the vines, though the produce of the olive fails, and the fields yield no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold, and there is no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer, and makes me tread upon the heights. Somehow, even in the middle of everything happening around him, even in the middle of this time when the fig tree does not bloom and the olive tree fails in its produce, even then the prophet is able to rejoice in God. It is an incredibly beautiful statement of trust, not bound up with results, but only with the goodness and faithfulness of God. Maybe sometimes living by faith can even look like that. There's no need to start there, though. It's enough to start where the prophet starts, with honesty, with openness, and with an expectation that God is not finished. The invitation is there today, in whatever uncertainty we face. Trust that God is faithful, and take a step. Amen.